Hello and welcome to this second video cast created in partnership between the National Fire Chiefs Council and the United Kingdom Rescue Organisation. I am Ian Marriott, the Director of Education and Development for the UKRO, and I will be your host for today's topic, which is clinical governance. We will discuss what clinical governance is, the benefits for both the fire and rescue service and for firefighters, and we'll also talk about the risks of not having clinical governance arrangements in place. I'm joined virtually by a panel of experts from across the fire and medical sector. Joining me is Neil Urden, the Chief Fire Officer for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight Fire and Rescue Service. Neil also happens to be the Chair of the United Kingdom Rescue Organisation. Also joining us is Tim Nutbeam, a consultant in emergency medicine at the University Hospitals of Plymouth. Tim is also a consultant with Devon Air Ambulance. From Wiltshire Fire and Rescue Service, we have Simon Todd. Simon is an operational station manager, the NFCC trauma lead, and also the UKRO medical lead. Our next guest is Andrew Thurgood. Andrew is a consultant in pre-hospital emergency medicine and the Deputy Clinical Director for West Midlands Care Team. And finally, we have Jim Kinsella, a Station Commander in West Midlands Fire and Rescue Service. Jim was responsible for coordinating their clinical governance arrangements. Welcome everybody, and thank you for taking time out of your busy diaries to share your knowledge and provide us with your expertise and opinions. Before we discuss clinical governance, let's clarify what the responsibilities the Fire and Rescue Service have with regards to a casualty response. Simon, if I can come to you. So can you explain to us what responsibilities the Fire and Rescue Service have for that clinical response regarding to as an employer?
Yeah, hi Ian. I think from a legal perspective, I think the place we've got to go to from our duty of care is the Health and Safety Executive. This is quite clear within the first aid regulations, and it requires all employers to provide adequate and appropriately trained staff and appropriate equipment to ensure that all employees receive their immediate attention if they are injured or taken ill at work or within the workplace. I think it's important to note as well that we need to probably identify for fire and rescue services that within that statement, we need to be quite clear about what and where our workplaces are. The workplaces don't just consist of our fire stations, headquarters and training facilities. I think we have to identify that we work in quite a large area of challenging environments, and we have to take into account that our workplaces are varied and challenging that we work within.
So, just to clarify, would I be right in saying that as a fire and rescue service and as an employer, we need to assess the risks that our firefighters are going to be exposed to and put appropriate provisions in place to respond should one of our employees become ill or injured at work?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a risk-based approach, and we also have to take on board the treatment for members of the public that also may be involved within our workplaces as well. So this is an area that we have to take a risk-based approach for our staff and also the members of the public that may be involved within the incidents that we attend as well.
All right, thank you, Simon. Neil, if I can come to you. Could we look a little bit broader now, and can you just remind us what our responsibilities are as a fire and rescue service in terms of casualty and trauma care in a response environment?
Yeah, hi, and adding to what Simon just described, for a fire and rescue service, a number of things contained within the Fire and Rescue Services Act, which is our kind of primary, obviously, source of legislation. Most of that is enabling, so it allows it to happen. And most of what we do, actually, the British Fire and Rescue Service, I think it's fair to say, is about discovering, because of local risks, things that we can assist in. And therefore, the Act has always allowed us to do those things. It wasn't too long ago, but before response to road traffic accidents wasn't mandatory. It was something we did because we had the capacity to do, and we were on scene with equipment. So it shows you how the Act has changed over the years. Indeed, what we do has changed over the years. But more specifically to your question, the 2018 framework document in England, which governs or directs chief officers and fire authorities, particularly asks us to identify and assess those risks which may befall for our communities, and then indeed in turn to put in prevention, protection and response capabilities to deal with those things. So particularly for some of those services that are in maybe more rural areas or very busy areas, they might find themselves in situations where they are more likely to be on their own for longer periods of time before further medical assistance can be provided. And as Simon's pointed out, that's our workplace. That's where we're there supporting the injured. It may be RTCs or indeed fires. And we are in a position where our crews will be are in a situation where they'll be wanting to give treatment, need to give treatment to preserve the life of those individuals. So there's a great example where you're entitled to do it under the Act. You'll need to do it because of the risks you've assessed, and there'll be further medical support obviously coming from our colleagues across the ambulance service and others that can then get that person to the place of care they'll need. But it shows you it's about location, it's about the likelihood and the speed of support you'll get from elsewhere. And if it is realistic and foreseeable that you'll be there first and maybe there for some time, where you'll need that support coming later, then you're going to be expected to do something in the meantime. So that's where some fire rescue services have been doing this for much longer than others because they found themselves in that situation early or they've assessed it, and the framework document very much points towards that. There's obviously others. The duty to collaborate with other agencies was in the Police and Crime Act in 2017, and that insisted really work with other agencies to support their duties where you reasonably could. And that's another piece of it, sort of supporting legislation, which gives us a rise to do more. So it really is a matter of local analysis of the issues, identifying and assessing, and then the fire authority choosing to support that, which is perfectly acceptable and lawful within the Act. But indeed, then the how you do it and how well you do it comes onto the clinical governance question.
Right. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Simon. I think that sets the scene nicely as to and explains why, as a fire and rescue service, we need to have firefighters trained appropriately to provide casualty care. Tim, if I can come to you now, could you give us a little bit of an overview of what clinical governance is and how it applies to the fire and rescue service?
Yes, of course. So I think clinical governance is one of these terms which is quite difficult to define, and you can break it down into little bits. But effectively, what it's about is making sure that we offer the very best care for our patients. And those patients might be someone who's entrapped following a motor vehicle collision, or it might be one of our friends and colleagues who's tripped whilst tending to a fire in a burning building. And some of it is about clinical care, but that's really at the very pinnacle of what makes up a good clinical governance system. So we need a culture which understands the needs of our patients, that meets those needs effectively, and regularly reviews what they do, both in terms of audit and in terms of research and in terms of training, to make sure that the needs of our patients are met, and they're met in the best possible way and the most effective way. You'll be very used to applying such principles to the equipment you carry or how you extinguish a fire. And it's about taking those principles of doing the very best that we can do and applying them in a slightly different context to the needs of our patients.
Thank you, Tim. Andrew, is there anything you want to add in that area?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up what Tim said about your existing frameworks that you have for current working practices. A lot of my experience of working with West Midlands Fire Service was picking up these threads and bringing them together to create a system that ensured that patients got the best care. And a lot of the time it was just tweaking existing systems. So the fire service, have a lot of capability, and I think it just needs the focus to get to that end point where patient care can be assured and delivered to the highest standard possible. So I like the point Tim just made about what the service already has and using what you've got.
Right, thanks, Andrew. Before we delve a little bit more into clinical governance arrangements and how it applies to the Fire and Rescue Service, Tim, if I can just come back to you. I know you've been doing a substantial amount of research with your exit project. Can you just talk us through the process of that clinical research and how that fits in with clinical governance and how that eventually will apply to first responders?
Of course. So we've talked a little bit about clinical governance and how it's about creating this culture where we assess the needs of our patients. We make sure that our teams are educated and trained to meet those needs. And then it might be research, it might be audit, it might be maintenance of standards, but we ensure that we're constantly looking at our patients' needs and making sure that they're met. And all that is within the culture of kind of openness and sharing and kind of ensuring that we all work together. One of my particular interests is in post-collision care, so following a motor vehicle collision, and you'll all know what entrapment is and what extrication is. And it's really interesting. So what we've done as part of the exit project is effectively a small triangle of what clinical governance is. So we've said, what do these patients look like? What are their needs and how are those needs best met? So what do these patients look like? Historically, and within current kind of fire and rescue literature, there's a real focus on these patients having spinal cord injuries. So what we've done is we've gone out there and worked with other agencies like Trauma Audit Research Network and looked at all those patients who are trapped and work out what are these patients actually dying from, what injuries are time critical for them, what is the rate of spinal cord injury. And we've demonstrated that over the years, and we've got data going back to the 1950s and 1960s, that spinal cord injury is a very low cause of morbidity and mortality when compared to injuries such as head injury, chest injury, and abdominal injury. And spinal injury as a isolated phenomena is present in about 0.35% of the extrications we do on patients who are majorly injured. So that's a very, very, very small number of the 7,000 or so extrications which are delivered by fire and rescue services in the UK each year. So if you imagine 0.3% of people have these isolated spinal injuries, the other 97.7% have got other time critical problems which probably need attention which isn't supported by a movement minimisation approach. So we've looked prospectively at different fire and rescue services. We've looked at retained firefighters and full-time firefighters in different environments, rural and urban. And we found that the average extrication time is between 30 and 32 minutes, and that's replicated again and again and again. That 32 minutes, if you're bleeding to death, is a really important time. And we know that there's an excess mortality associated with extrication, and we've proven that as well. So even once you take into account people's comorbidities, so that's what's wrong with them medically, their physiology, so that's things like their heart rate and their blood pressure, and each of the individual injuries they've got and their ages, we've demonstrated that being trapped has an excess mortality, so leads to an excess number of deaths, which currently just isn't explained. And we think that's because of how long extrication takes. And you can imagine if you've got a bleeding spleen or your kidneys being torn off your renal artery, 30 minutes is a long time to continue bleeding for. And we can do very little about that non-compressible hemorrhage inside a vehicle. Another piece of the project is looking at the biomechanics of extrication. So we've looked at the movements associated with extrication and quite clearly demonstrated that what we thought worked doesn't work. And things like roof-off extrication cause exactly the same amount of movement as a rapid extrication and exactly the same amount of movement as a B-post rip, for example. And self-extrication is far superior. So we know that passive patient movements, when we do stuff to patients, that causes big movements. Active patient movements, when they do stuff for themselves, that causes a lot less movement. And I think a reasonable analogy is if Andy had a broken arm, I wouldn't wish that on you, Andy, but if you did, and I asked him to move his arm from point A to point B, if I did that to him, it'd probably cause a lot of movements and a lot of pain. Whereas if I asked it to do him himself, he would hold it in a position where it was most comfortable, and we'd see that fracture move far less when we moved it from point A to point B. Now you kind of blow that up so it affects the whole patient. You can see how that might hold true. Another part of the project was asking the patient's perspective. So what did they want from extrication? And the final part was taking all this data from the multiple trials that we've done and putting it into an expert consensus group and coming out with new recommendations, new principles on what we should base extrication. So we take that and say, all right, well, what's that got to do with clinical governance? Well, there's a lot in there. So there's new principles which will need education and training. There's a new understanding of patients' injuries, and that's all about clinical effectiveness. And we know now that we can monitor those injuries over time and extrication over time by linking national databases, whether that be TARN or the National Fire Extrication Database, and that's about clinical audit. We're sharing that results, and we're sharing them widely and being open that perhaps we've got this wrong historically, perhaps we set off on the wrong foot in terms of absolute movement minimisation, and that's about openness. The whole thing is about risk management. How do we deal with the risk associated with our patients and our personnel? And then finally, there's something around information management. How do we share this information? How do we make it available to our personnel? And how do we improve the outcomes and watch those outcomes improving? And you know what? We might not get it right again. And clinical governance is about constantly revisiting these principles, constantly revisiting the needs of our patients, and then tweaking our service, educating our personnel, and empowering and enabling them to deliver excellent patient care.
Right. Thank you, Tim. I think that's a really good example of how research can influence future practices. And I know there's a big piece of work ongoing trying to get your principles that you've come out of the Exit project into the practices that first responders undertake on the incident ground. Andy, if I can come back to you, if we go back to clinical governance a little bit more. So you support West Midlands Fire and Rescue Service with clinical governance arrangements. Can you just explain a little bit what the implications are on a fire and rescue service regards to clinical governance?
Sure. The implications for having clinical governance within a fire service are actually quite wide-ranging. And most areas of the service are impacted by having the system in place, whether it be the training team, whether it be the tools that the service carries and how they are deployed, how the firefighters on the ground operate. Every area of the service is impacted. And if I take an example think of a CAT tourniquet, how to stop somebody bleeding to death from a catastrophic limb bleed. If a new piece of kit comes into the system, into the medical world, how is that implemented within the service? So procurement get involved, the research is done on the piece of equipment, it's then looked at, viability studies carried out. Does it work with the firefighters with their equipment that they're wearing, with their gloves, for example, in context? Everything is looked at and then taken back and reviewed. Now, if you didn't have clinical governance, somebody would say, we've got a new piece of kit, let's order it and bring it into place. And it'll probably fail, hitting the fire ground, because all those steps haven't been taken to get it into operational use. So if you don't have governance, you can't move forward with the running pack. And as Tim has wonderfully illustrated, medicine evolves, pre-hospital care evolves, is now a subspeciality in its own right. And not having the governance system in place impacts on the service because you can't keep up with those innovations. And I think that's a real motivator going forward for any service looking towards introducing clinical governance. The implications are profound and they affect all areas. Without it, you can't keep up with the evolving systems that are around you, particularly in health.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Has any of you got anything you'd like to add to that?
I think people worry that it's going to mean that introducing clinical governance means that you always need to have the latest and most Gucci bit of kit, and that it's going to be expensive and there's going to be lots of money and resources and training thrown at it. Actually, what it's about is understanding the needs of our patients, and often it's about ensuring that we do the basics, what's important for our patients, really, really well. It's not about having the latest bit of kit. It's about enabling and empowering our team to deliver our patients' needs. And often that's a very small set of interventions done to a very high standard. And actually, I think where fire and rescue services have fallen down historically is perhaps having the resource to invest in the latest bit of kit and having the resource to make it available to their firefighters, which is in some way excellent. But it's not excellent if it doesn't meet your patient needs. It's not excellent if it doesn't come with training. It's not excellent if it doesn't come with a culture where people go, you know what, I don't quite know how to use this and I wish I did. And it's only by having those clinical governance structures underpinning that clinical care that you can get it right and really meet the needs of your patients.
Thanks, Tim. I think you've raised some really valid points, and I think you are right. In some cases, fire and rescue services have been guilty of that a little bit. Neil, if I can come to you. So I know you've got clinical governance arrangements in place, and that's provided by a private sector company. Could you just talk us through the benefits you've experienced in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight Fire and Rescue Service by having those arrangements in place?
The reassurance as a chief officer, because I'm no expert in this area at all, it is the kind of key point. I'll come back to that in a second. The way and whether we or the fire authority decide to do firefighting at sea, medical intervention, whatever it does, needs governing, like all decisions. So the way in which we describe governance in our organisation is the way in which our organisation controls and operates, and the mechanism by which we and our people are held to account. So that's the kind of our version of what governance actually is, and the same thing is applied completely to clinical activity. Now, again, clinical activity has been defined by others much more insightful than I. Is a matter which has been described really well, I think. So for us, originally we set it up when we started to co-respond some years ago, more than 10 years ago, to support that foreseeable aspect of the gap in our care across our county, where we had areas which the ambulance service could only get to a bit later than some other places. So we were very, very focused on needing to provide this cover. We were providing this cover. It's also, over the years, become much more needed, not only through COVID, but other things. So clinical governance gave us that kind of framework, the behaviours, the understanding, and all those sorts of things have been described already. But for me, where the great capability came when we could go directly to people like Andrew and Tim, to our clinical governors, is saying, so we need a change now because something's happened. Something's happened either because, in this instance, COVID came along. So very early, we were all waiting for insight into PPE levels. So how do we treat people that we come across who may need CPR? Very quickly, we could make a phone call on that day when COVID became real to our clinical governors saying, we need guidance quickly. I need guidance that I can hold you to account on as my clinical governors, and equally I can make sure I am held to account on in following those new procedures which we can adapt very quickly. So it's a great example of being able to move very fast, and one of the great advantages of having good clinical governance throughout your organisation. It's not just about the advice you get, but then your assurance about it will be carried out through the mechanisms of your organisation, right through to the casualty care and the aftermath of any sort of analysis or indeed public inquiry. So the speed, the levels of qualification and knowledge you can have in this area, and then the subsequent assurance as a chief fire officer to say, I know I haven't got to go to wait for someone else nationally to come up with this. That is important eventually, but equally I can get it very fast from an organisation that I employ or commission to give me this assurance as one part of that, to get me quickly to move into the new spaces. Another great example would be around things like vaccination. Now, clearly, vaccination is not a matter of normally for us at all. But you can imagine being told, in one sense, don't worry, we'll supervise you from the NHS. That's great. And of course, that was the key process for assurance. But actually, with my own governance, making sure that we were taking the measures we needed to take as my employees, as it were, gave me double security that we were actually in safe hands and we were doing things very carefully and clinically correctly, so that we couldn't possibly, get caught short if that were to go wrong in some way. So it gives us for many years, I think we've sort of stepped into these spaces. And of course, we can help. Of course, we can do what's right, and we always will do that as a sector because we're here to do that. But actually, what clinical governance has shown me is the importance of making sure you do it well. Something Tim said earlier, you do it correctly, you do it with a decent amount of insight, so you can have due diligence before you rush into an emergency situation and just help out as best you can. Now we can foresee lots of things from things that have happened over the years, including some of the major disasters across the country, but also COVID. We can now be prepared knowing that suddenly things will come our way, and we've got to have the speed of response as well as a national response. We can find new standards and other things. We can find the speed of response locally to get on with it and assist our partners and our communities quickly. The thing I would say, though, from a chief fire officer's perspective, we know there's a lot of concern over roles of firefighters and things like that. This is not about that. This is about the abilities of fire and rescue services to be able to assure themselves that they're covered and protecting their staff, their communities, and their authorities, of course, legally and safely, to make sure we can do a good job every time. So it's been a real asset to us in Hampshire and Isle of Wight. We've been able to do things that otherwise a long time to get guidance on, whether it be PPE levels, early doors, deciding not to do chest only CPR very early, because rather than wait for national guidance, we could make that decision very early with our clinical governors. You could move very fast, and that's what I think we need to better do as an emergency service.
Thank you, Neil. I know this is a subject that you're really passionate about, and we've had long conversations about the benefits clinical governance has provided to Hampshire and the Isle of Wight Fire and Rescue Service. So that's looked at it from a strategic point of view. Jim, if I can come to you, thank you for your patience. Could you explain to us what the benefits clinical governance provides to a firefighter?
Thanks, Ian. So I think it's fair to say that if you asked firefighters this question, most wouldn't know what clinical governance is. When we look at the pillars of clinical governance, the operational considerations are primarily around education and training. The other areas provide more assurance to the service on the quality and effectiveness of that training and the equipment that the operational teams have. As a sector, we talk a lot about operational excellence. And I've never met a firefighter who doesn't aim for that and wear it like a badge of honour. Clinical governance is a framework that, when applied, ensures operational excellence in pre-hospital care. When a rescue has been affected, whether it be from a fire, an RTC, or any of those areas we operate in, and a casualty is placed in front of a firefighter, a well-governed system ensures that the firefighter has the best possible training and knowledge to assess, treat, and hopefully have a positive impact on that casualty. Also, by ensuring that the fire and rescue services have an effective clinical governance framework in place, we know that our practices for treatment of casualties are complying with all the relevant legislations, which is then protecting the firefighters from any potential legal pitfalls they may have when treating a casualty. And for me, that's what clinical governance means to a firefighter.
Thank you, Jim. That was really helpful. And really useful piece of information for our firefighters. Neil, if I can come back to you, if I may. So some recent events have put a little bit of a spotlight on the Fire and Rescue Service in regard to the medical response we provide. What's the current position from the NFCC?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. So, as you say, a number of events, including Manchester Arena and others, have drawn a spotlight. Now it would be wrong to talk about that yet until that's finally, more publicly released. Yeah. But nonetheless, across a range of issues, we have seen that what some services are doing really, really well, and we heard some great examples here today, and there are others across the country that do a great job at this. Looking to share that best practice, equally to recognise where services perhaps don't need the levels that we've heard about today, and that's equally okay in terms of that identification and the risk-based, as Simon mentioned. So the National Fire Chiefs Council, we had a conversation amongst chiefs around what clinical governance is, and which has been really well highlighted today, where chiefs think they have it and where they know they haven't. Because some instances where people think they've got clinical governance because they've got support from perhaps the ambulance service, and that may not actually be considered as having clinical governance. It's good to have ambulance support, of course, but it may not be the same thing. So we had a long conversation about that. We've done a survey, and chief officers across the country are very keen to develop clinical governance for all fire and rescue services. So in fact, having Simon on the call is very helpful today, because the NFCC via the Operations Committee is looking at this issue very closely to try and develop more guidance for chief officers and services to say, what does it look like, what's good look like, and what are the options you have. Not everyone needs to follow every single model we've got, but equally we've talked about, and it's not yet been agreed, but we talked about potentially having or being consumed in a national standard. As you may be in England, there are independent national standards board, and that may be a standard we could write. But it may be that it gets consumed in a more broader assurance standard, and having those conversations at the moment. So I think the details we've been describing today for this video are very much the ones we're talking about nationally, and saying how do we best bring that, allowing local determination about to what extent authorities and services want to do this depending on their risk, but also giving good guidance about what good looks like, and knowing that the market is there to be able to support you, either doing it in a way that some services or others do. So that's where we are from the National Fire Chief's perspective, and lots of work that I know Simon is very busy doing, and others of course, but I know Simon's leading on that work at the moment.
Andy, if I can come back to you, we've talked lots about clinical governance now. I'm not sure what the situation is nationally, but what would the risk be to a fire and rescue service if they didn't have those clinical governance arrangements in place?
Well, the risks to the service of not having a governance system in place are actually wide-ranging, and for the purpose of this sort of discussion, I'll focus on the legal, reputational, and moral domains. From a legal perspective, the fire rescue service have a duty of care when they respond, and which comes with its obligations, which all point towards that the patient receives the best and safest care possible. What care they get has to be evidence-based, has to be delivered to the highest standard with the best equipment, and any information that's collected around the patient in terms of data and personal information is respected and treated with the strictest confidentiality that you would expect in the NHS. Generally, the law imposes a duty of care on a care provider in situations where it's reasonably foreseeable that the care provider might cause harm to patients through their actions or not doing something. And clearly that applies to the fire service and a firefighter responding to a casualty. This is the case regardless of whether that firefighter is experienced or newly qualified. And as soon as you step forward to accept a responsibility to look after a casualty, all this comes with you. It's important to remember that this sort of concentration of responsibility it actually focuses on just basic interventions. It can actually be quite complex. It doesn't make a difference. There isn't weighting against each. The responsibility is shared amongst anything you do to a patient. So to discharge your duty of care, you must act with the relevant standards, and the standards that are set within the NHS are the ones that the fire service should be resonating with and tracking. And if you fail to provide that standard, because there's no governance to ensure that you correctly train using the right equipment, then you'll be held accountable. And the standard that you'll be assessed against will be what an ordinary competent individual will be able to do in those same circumstances. And failure to discharge that will be regarded as negligent. So, coming down to what are the risks, if you don't deliver the right patient care, you will be seen as negligent, and that comes with obviously the legal follow-up as a result. If harm comes to a patient and they try to find out what the cause was, who had the duty of care, that's where the negligence will be focused towards, and the service would have to defend the allegation and the legal process. So I mentioned this briefly but a newly qualified firefighter would be expected to deliver safe care in the same way as a more experienced care provider. So you can't say that you give leniency to one just because of the amount of time they've been doing the job. The standards are the same from when you start to when you finish. And clinical governance makes sure that the patient gets the best care in all circumstances that the firefighter is working in. And without that, the risks are significant. The end point is that the patient doesn't get what they need, and we're all in the game of looking after people and saving lives. So, from a reputational point of view, if you carry out care which fails and there's harm as a result of it, then unfortunately the press and various other outlets will pick up on this and illuminate it significantly, and there's reputational harm as a result of that. It's better to invest in a governance system to try and mitigate any problems and avoid the press finding something going wrong. The patient gets the best care and the press have nothing to report. Better to be proactive and promote excellence and preventing harm than reacting to it, is my view.
Thanks, Andrew. Tim, is there anything you'd like to add to that from your perspective?
I think we can worry about legislation, and we can be, worried about the government or lawyers or the threat of legal promise or barristers coming down on our teams. But I think there's another aspect to this, and I have never worked with a group of individuals who are so driven, and came up in our conversation earlier, to deliver excellence. And we've all, and I think everyone listening to this video would have witnessed patients probably dying when they wish they were enabled in some way to stop that, or enabled to deliver a higher level of care, or enabled to understand the situation so they could offer the very best care that they could to their patients. And I think we've got a group of individuals working for fire and rescue services whose inherent why they do the work is to look after people. And the way we engage with those people, and the way we support those people, and the way we support people to deliver satisfying and rewarding careers, which in turn help us and our organisations, is to make sure that they are supported in things like this. So I think you can have a look at the legal risk and you can have a look at the legislation, but actually we need to look after our people, and looking after our people involves enabling them to look after their patients the very best that they can do.
Thanks, Tim. I think you've raised some really good points there that are going to resonate with a lot of firefighters across the country. Simon, if I can just come back to you briefly. So we've talked a lot about the clinical governance and the structure that comes with that. So what would the situation be if you have clinical governance but you don't follow the guidance that comes with it? What risk does that put fire and rescue services at?
And I think I sort of have to echo really what Andrew's just said, really, because I think he put it quite well, when obviously for a fire and rescue service that doesn't implement these risk and control measures, an approach to clinical governance is just the same as somebody or a fire and rescue service that does provide clinical governance and then fails to maintain it. And I think the challenge that all environments would have, and I think we can probably just take it back to something simple, like the breathing apparatus approach that we take. There's a level of legalities, a level of required training, maintenance of skills, etc., and an ongoing level of delivery required to ensure that our firefighters are safe whilst using breathing apparatus, and that sits within a legal duty of care. And if we were to fail in that area, I think we can probably all understand the ramifications where effectively, it would cause harm to our firefighters. And this, again, goes back to what Tim was saying. Realistically, the whole focus of clinical governance, and we shouldn't be scared of it. We shouldn't be scared of clinical governance, because I think that's one of the biggest challenges that fire and rescue services have in front of them is, I think if we're completely honest with ourselves, we probably don't understand it. And when we hear the word clinical, we think medical, we think hospital, we think ambulance. It's nothing to do with us. This is about them and not us. We'll just continue to do what we've always done, and we'll move forward. And I think the challenges, like Andrew and Tim have put quite well to us, is that the recognition that we do have a duty of care. And I think one of the phrases I think we will hear going forward is the term the care gap. And this concept that the fire and rescue service attends an incident before the medical services arrive, and we can provide a level of support for that injured or unwell patient casualty before that medical professional turns up. and that duty of care that we've got. So whether we do not implement clinical governance or we fail to maintain clinical governance, I think the risks are exactly the same. I'm sure, and I'm not a legal barrister by any means, but I'm sure they would see us in exactly the same light, and we can't really challenge that failure in any other way other than through a lack of delivery, really. And it's important that we maintain it. We can't just train our staff one day and then not maintain those levels of skills and training. We can't write those policies and procedures and then not constantly keep them reviewed and up to date. We do it with all parts of our organisation and all the skills and activities we do as fire and rescue services. And this is just one other area of a firefighter skill set that we need to identify. And I think, we've talked a lot about clinical governance and the term around it, but it's certainly not to be concerned about and not to be worried about. This is just about implementing a system of work and a system of maintenance that is providing a safe level of care for the communities that we serve as fire and rescue services. And it's the public that we come across during our incidents, as well as our own members of staff, where we have a legal duty of care under the Health and Safety Act as well. So it's identifying those areas and putting in place safe practices, and more importantly, maintaining those safe practices. And I think that's probably where we need to be.
Can I come back, Ian, to some comments that Neil and Tim have raised, and Simon has just done so as well? Is this this principle that clinical governance is required when there's a need for the fire rescue service to fill a therapeutic vacuum, or to fill the space before the other services arrive. In my experience, and I'm sure many of us here, on the ground when a patient's been treated, it's a multidisciplinary approach, and there isn't a handing over as such. Fire service will work with us looking after patients. They may be doing supportive things, putting on splints or helping holding somebody or talking somebody. It's all very important part of the equation, but they are part of the health response as well as the gap fillers before the health arrive, if you want to call it that way. So I think when you talk of it in those terms, I find it hard to think where governance doesn't fit, because everyone's involved in patient care. You're not looking for a specific gap to fill. It happens across the board and across the country. So I'll be interested to see how that discussion pans out through the national sort of forum, really.
Thanks, Andrew. Really useful information across the board there. One final question, just going back to Neil, and you've possibly covered this, but you might want to elaborate a little bit more. So taking it into everything into consideration that we've discussed today about clinical governance, the direction of travel for the UK Fire and Rescue Service, what do you think the future looks like for UK Fire in terms of clinical governance?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And just immediately to pick up that point that Andrew just raised, I think he's absolutely right. Because another hat on, I lead the prevention work across the National Fire Chiefs Council. Another great example, foreseeable, is entering someone's home, doing a safe and well visit, and you find yourself having to assist in some way or another. And in those moments, it's foreseeable that that's going to happen, has happened to many teams out there. Then it's important we give those teams the very best advice and support in what they should do in those circumstances, the best training, the best understanding about signposting, other issues. So this isn't always just about rushing off to scenes of nasty accidents or those issues. It's people every day of their lives, could be outside the fire station, could be in their homes, where we interact with them and find ourselves interacting with them, where we want to give the very best support to our teams to better act. I can certainly recall when I first joined, I won't say when, a long time ago now, sadly, but what you can do with a triangle bandage and do your best with that type of thing, it has enormously moved on, thank goodness, in terms of what the skills we have and indeed the equipment that we carry. But the same is true for lots of things we do, adapting a short extension ladder to do something else. Nowadays, we do a lot more of getting the right kit for the right job, the right training, the right governance around that kit. That's where the British Fire Service has changed dramatically over the last sort of 20 years or so. And that's very much where this is going. We work really hard across fire and rescue services, as many public service partners do around safeguarding, around protecting vulnerable people, and they are very closely governed by various measures in local authorities and others. This is the same thing, really. It's just in a slightly different subject. It's really about making sure that patients, organisations, people are safeguarded using a mechanism. And so, for me, the future is pretty clear. Personally, every time I hear a conversation like this, take part in one, I become more passionate about making sure that we do get a standard, and we do make sure this is featured very strongly in our arrangements. I think we are sort of lagging slightly in terms of giving our people the support they need. Lots of changes coming, white papers and other things. But what I think is very clear, the British Fire and Rescue Service has and is helping in these spaces, taking Andrew's point about being with other emergency services or there before or thereafter, but it doesn't matter. It's about being able to assist those people most in need, making sure that we are legally in the right place, as well as our moral ability to say we can act, knowing we know what we're doing, and we will always make things better, rather than acting with good faith and making it worse without realising. We want to avoid that at all costs, and that's for me is where this conversation about clinical governance drives those passions even more deeply in my mind. I know it does for all of us around this kind of conversation, but I can see that becoming almost a matter in a few years' time we won't even talk about it anymore because it happens everywhere. So, and let's hope that's the case. So hopefully this video for listeners and viewers has been insightful for people, and it should be making us ask more questions about what we are doing in our own organisations, but importantly what we can do more of to make it even better still. So I'm grateful for the time, actually, and I've always learned when I listen to these guys here. I always learn lots about it, and so I'm no expert. I can get the assurance that my organisation is doing something at least to protect itself and protect our communities we come across. I want to help others do a similar thing. Thank you, Ian.
That brings us to the end of our discussion. I would like to thank our panel of experts who have provided us with a greater understanding of clinical governance and why it is necessary. We've considered the benefits for the Fire and Rescue Service and for firefighters. Neil has provided us with the current position from the National Fire Chief Council, while Simon has offered us a small insight into the work that is currently ongoing to set standards across the sector. What is clear from our discussions today is that clinical governance is not about having a service level agreement in place. It's about having arrangements to ensure the best possible patient care and a mechanism to provide that continuous improvement. We've demonstrated that by having effective leadership and adopting the principles that are already embedded in the Fire and Rescue Service, that clinical governance is something that we can embrace. I do hope you've found the information provided useful. Until next time, stay safe.